Hot. Hi. I'm Billy Garrett.
Pleasure to meet you.
Yep.
Thanks for all this. Okay, there you go.
Good afternoon. My name is Billy Garrett. I'm the executive director of the New Mexico History Museum for 3 days and 1 more hour. And then I will be riding into retirement, into the sunrise, not the sunset, as they say. I want to welcome you all here. When I started at the museum in almost 7 years ago, one of the things I was surprised to learn was the history of the connections between the Palace of the Governors and the people who were there at the beginning of the century, the last century. And those connections which led to SAR and the History Museum. And one of the things that I resolved was that it was important for the History Museum to reach out to SAR. SAR actually was reaching out to us as well, but for us to find common cause around things that we do share in common. And so it's a great pleasure for me, as one of my last acts, to kick off the Hewett seminar. And I want to thank Morris Foster for the work that we've done together. I think it's a great series that's coming up. And thank you all for being here.
Hi, I'm Morris Foster. I'm president of SAR. I want to thank Billy for being such a collegial and engaged partner in this and many other things. And we're happy that Billy is going to be on, and will continue on the SAR advisory board into the far future. So we'll have the benefit of his engagement and advice. We're here to learn more about Edgar Lee Hewett, and the founder of almost everything in Santa Fe. It would take me too long to list all the things he founded. It would be shorter for me to list the things he did not found in Santa Fe. And so we're really excited about this. We're pleased to have you all here, and I'm not going to keep things too long. Dr. Bruce Bernstein is going to handle the introductions. Bruce is the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer at San Ildefonso Pueblo. And much like Edgar Lee Hewett, Bruce has had many positions in Santa Fe of importance, of cultural and anthropological and archaeological importance. So we're very pleased to have him also as a senior scholar at SAR. So there's just a lot of entangled relationships that are very healthy and good for all of us. So Bruce, I'll let you take the show.
Well, welcome everyone, and thank you for coming out today. We really appreciate you're here. Doing something about Hewett, talking about Hewett, has been a long time dream of mine, and with the assistance of the History Museum and SAR, we've been able to do that. Hewett, of course, founded the School for American Archaeology, as it was called, in 1907, and founded the Museum in New Mexico in the Palace of the Governors building in 1909. Probably demonstrating his force and his nickname El Toro in both instances. On the east end of the palace building, the Historical Society of New Mexico was well lodged. They'd been there since the 1880s. And so one night in 1909, he had Jesse Nussbaum put a new door between the two sides of the building. That was his way of welcoming the Historical Society into the new Museum in New Mexico School for Advanced Research. Hewett was loved and loathed at the same time, and he did build and sustain Southwest Archaeology, the Museum in New Mexico, the School for Advanced Research, and Santa Fe as a destination and as an arts community as well. And as Billy said, he touched everything. And even being in Amelia White's living room today, this is a room he never would have entered in his lifetime. It is a room that Amelia White never would have invited him into during his lifetime. They had a very acrimonious, separate side relationship. But Hewett without a doubt would take full credit for the SAR today and being here in this room together. So thank you, Edgar. Rethinking Hewett celebrates the digitization of the Hewett archives, photo and paper archives. And with me today are two colleagues, Hannah Abelbeck and Heather McClurg, and both have been instrumental in putting together this series. It's been a pleasure to work with them. I really appreciate everything they've done. Great partners in visioning and creating what we're here today to be. Hannah had also said about the papers, it opens space for conversation about the stories these records tell and those they've misunderstood or left out. Hannah will present with Alicia Romero in our next talk on February 24th, which reminds me to tell you this is a 4-part lecture series that we're very excited about, and I hope that you'll be able to make the next 3 as well. We're going to begin, we had thought that we would begin tonight's talk with Heather McClurg, the librarian at the Palace, to come up and show you just a few tidbits from what she has seen, found, learned from, clarified in the Hewett archives themselves. So Heather, if you'll please come up. Thanks. Oh, I should say, this is one of the photographs out of Hewett's archives. I've been researching Hewett for probably 30 years, and particularly San Ildefonso's relationship with him. Don't worry, Heather, I'll make it short. And I saw the first time I opened the archives, and I searched for San Ildefonso, I saw this photograph. This is probably 1907 or 1908, and this man here is Julian Martinez, and he's carrying down the mountain probably in those panniers, those handmade by wood and using green boughs to cushion the pottery he's taking back to the museum and supposedly sending off to the Smithsonian. Heather, please come up.
Thank you very much, Bruce. Okay. Good afternoon. Thank you to all you wonderful people for coming out and being willing to engage with history and archaeology and the ideas here. My name is Heather McClurg. I am a librarian and archivist at the Fray Angelico Chavez History Library at the New Mexico History Museum, and I was the manager of increasing public access to the treasures of Edgar L. Hewett's American Southwest, the long title for the digital project that made all these materials that brought these amazing collections to the world and have brought us all together and given us full access, global access to documents to reconsider and rethink. So I just wanted to I have a visual aid. I did want to, because I'm going to throw a few numbers at you, but I did want to say that this is an archival acid-free document box. And this is 1 linear foot. It's based on the measurement on the front where it sits on the shelf. And that is important because I'd like you to keep that archival term in mind. The entire Hewett collection is 63,208 pages in 24 linear feet, about the equivalent, that and the equivalent of that. And each box feels like it weighs about the same as the core at the center of the Earth, but it's more about the size and weight of a medium-sized dog, so 1.5 corgis or a schnauzer. And since this is the first lecture in what I'm sure will be a fascinating series, I thought I would start at the beginning. In the early days of this project, I gave a talk to the Friends of History, the Friends group at the New Mexico History Museum. And it was a 45-minute espresso-fueled talk, and I barely scratched the surface of Box 1. But I wanted to return to Box 1 because it is the box containing the founding documents for the School of American Archaeology and the original name of SAR. And did I find them? And here are a few that I thought were interesting. Here is a copy of the resolution adopted by the Committee on the American Archaeology, Committee on American Archaeology of the Archaeological Institute of America. So that was the first institution where these ideas were brought forward to make a school of American archaeology. And this was in November 1908, and that put the force of AIA behind this institution. And this is a letter from John McPhee, who was president of the New Mexico Archaeological Society, which was founded in 1898. He was also a territorial judge, and he is writing to ethnologist and AIA committee chair Alice Cunningham Fletcher about the offer of the Palace of the Governors to house the new school. And here is a very key sentence that is in the little blow up there. It is the further purpose of our society to organize a New Mexico branch of your institute with headquarters at Santa Fe and to extend to the school, if established, every support that is at the command of our members and their friends. And there were some powerful, politically connected people who were fully behind this institution's formation. And they had a lot of different reasons for doing it, but there was people rooting for this place. And this is from a 1907 letter from Edgar Hewett to Alice Cunningham Fletcher on the undertakings of the School of the American Archaeology. And Hewett and Fletcher were friends. They knew each other from working at the Bureau of American Ethnology in Washington, D.C., with John Wesley Powell. And it was her AIA committee that was responsible for the resolution that brought the school here in the first document slide that I showed. And this is a plan for the establishment of the School of American Archaeology, probably from about 1907, 1908. And it looks like it's about number 12 or so. It looks like 111 there. You'll notice that, and this has a good summary. Whoops, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. In the one that says 111, you'll notice the term field experience and training. And this was Hewett's absolute favorite thing to do. He was very much about getting students out into the field. And he had been taking students out into the field since he was president of the New Mexico Normal School, when he started archaeology classes there, and men and women went out together. It was very controversial at the time, out into the field. Picnics, the school board called them. And this is from Hewett's first report as the director of American Archaeology, because boy, this guy just loved to get titles attached to himself. And it does include, this is only just a small summary, or a small segment of it, it's a multi-page document, but it does have a good summary of the school settling in Santa Fe with some glossing over of the political dealings that made it all happen. And these things that I'm showing today, these are just from the Hewett collection. There are other interesting documents in related collections, also at Chavez Library, at the History Museum. And when I look at these documents, I feel like I could keep going back and back and back on the movement to raise the profile of American archaeology until I am standing in Ohio in the 1840s in the Scioto River Valley with Edwin Davis and Ephraim Squire, authors of one of the first books on American archaeology that had been published by the Smithsonian Institution. And their book was Ancient Monuments of the Mississippi Valley. And there they were, looking at the mounds and the earthworks that were all up and down the Ohio Valley and thinking, what are those? Maybe we should take a look. And a lot of the work here today done at SAR actually started in this box that I'm talking about today. AC 105, Box 1, Folder 2. And when I see you all again on Tuesday, February 24th, please buy your tickets. We'd love to see you again. For the next lecture in this series, I will be talking about letter salutations, nicknames, and what Alfred Tozer really thought about Hewett. So, yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Heather. That was terrific. You get a little idea of the depth of the Hewett papers. The first time I saw the Hewett papers, they were organized just as he had organized them. They were in stacks and boxes. And literally, you went through every page looking for things. There was no way to find anything else. I didn't realize there were 3,000 photographs until the digitization project. So there's so many wonderful things that I think that will come forward. So Our speaker tonight is James Snead, who's a professor of anthropology at the California State University at Northridge. He completed his PhD at UCLA and has since provided a vibrant catalog of public presentations, papers, academic papers, and publications. He's also the author of Ruins and Rivals, Ancestral Landscapes of the Pueblo World, one of my favorites, and Relic Hunters, Archaeology in the Public in the 19th Century America. All three immensely readable and recommended to you. James is a Santa Fe native, growing his archaeological interests and credentials from a young age. He used to bathe in the pond at San Cristobal Ranch, unaware that there was a large ancestral village just over the hill and miles of petroglyphs throughout that. One day he was sitting at home and talking with a bud, and they decided they wanted to be archaeologists. And within a few weeks' time, James was out at Chaco Canyon during the days when they were first kind of uncovering, deciding what the roads were about, as well as the Sundagger as well. So it was an exciting time for a beginning of a young Santa Fe lad. James has summarized Hewett's often praised and just as often maligned career as this. Traditional archaeological histories characterize Hewett as having been more of a politician than a scientist, a poor field worker, a negative influence, soon cast off by a younger generation of scholars. What is frequently overlooked in the disparagement of Hewett is his political power and influence in Western society of the day through membership in dozens of organizations, extensive correspondence, involvement in state politics, and above all, frequent public lecture tours. When I first began thinking about these lectures many years ago, I thought of James first as a person that I wanted to come, I wanted to work with. I needed someone to help me intellectually in organization of the seminar that follows, the advanced seminar later this spring. I again turned to James, and finally when Hannah, Heather, and I first discussed a lecture series, James was our first obvious choice. I might also admit that when I first read his Ruins and Revivals book, my self-absorbed first thought was, damn, I wish I had written that. Well, we all can't be James to think so broadly and big, at the same time considering the minutiae of archaeology, archaeological history and theory in ancient civilizations. But fortunately for us, we can enjoy and learn from his scholarship and sharp wit here today. James.
What Bruce was too kind to mention in that lovely introduction was that when we were sitting in a living room with my friend Joseph Sneros on holiday from Santa Fe High School in about 1977 or 78, and just chatting away about how nice it would be to be an archaeologist, his dad was in the next room. Jose Cisneros was at that time one of the higher officials in the Southwest region of the National Park Service. And he was really tired of hearing us yak about how nice it would be to be an archaeologist. So he literally picked up the phone, called the Chaco Center, and told them that we were on our way. And he walked into the room and said, "Pack your bags, boys, you're due to Chaco Canyon." And we were, shall we say, a little startled about this, and maybe it was the summer, and it was hot, and we weren't quite sure that we wanted that to happen in that way, but that was the way it went. So I'm grateful to Mr. Cisneros for that opportunity and others that came after this. I'm grateful to Bruce and to Hannah and Heather for this opportunity, for being here. This is one of the more remarkable rooms anywhere to talk about anything anthropological in, and in particular Edgar Lee Hewett, although as Bruce noted, wouldn't have ever been here himself. So I've got a little clock on the screen here, which I'm grateful for, because otherwise who knows where we'd end up. And so let's get started, and I'll try not to get too entangled with this subject. So everyone in Santa Fe who is at least minimally conscious of some of the cultural history of the last basically the late territorial and early statehood period here, should be haunted by Hewett. I know I am. I can't go downtown. I can't look at what we used to call the Fine Arts Museum and think about, the architecture there and Santa Fe style and Hewett. I can't go to a Fiesta event without thinking about Hewett in some kind of way. I'm an archaeologist. I went on field trips as a kid to Bandelier, and there's the whole Hewett thing at Bandelier. But it's deeper than that for many of us. There are people in the community who actually knew Hewett in his sort of declining years. For me, it's one of the particular ghostly natures of this guy in the Smokey the Bear hat, is that he allowed my great-grandmother, who had not had a formal education, to be enrolled at the New Mexico Normal School in something like 1900 after interviewing her in his office, and he figured that she was smart enough to be in college, even if she hadn't ever really been in school. And she writes in her oral history, which was written down by some family members some years later, that those were the best years of her life, or taking classes at the Normal in Las Vegas. And so I think about that, and I think about a lot of things. But to stretch the metaphor of being haunted, there's a lot of sort of darker sides to this, more interesting angles that a lot of people in previous generations had a hard time with and sort of overlooked and got around for a variety of reasons. And so one of the beauties of the work that Heather and her team have done digitizing all those papers is it puts the whole story, at least as represented in that particular slice of documentary record, for people to make use of and to think about, and to maybe reevaluate some of these things. And it's good time for this for a lot of reasons. And so this lecture series and our seminar we're going to have in the spring, focused on Hewett. I was talking to Morris earlier on, and I noted that we've had just about everybody who Bruce and a few that I had suggested wanted to come to this. They're signed up. It takes not much arm twisting to get people to come to Santa Fe and talk about Hewett. And even though a few of us know each other, so it's going to be a really interesting time, and I'm really looking forward to where these things go. Well, we're not going to be haunted by this Hewett today. We're going to be haunted, or maybe a little bit, sort of a middle-aged archaeologist here in this famous photograph. We're thinking more about this Hewett, a photograph taken in 1893. The thing about Hewett and almost all of his contemporaries were there were no such things as professional archaeologists in the 1890s, or at least not until the middle 1890s. The people who were doing archaeology here, anywhere else, from Squire and Edwin Davis mentioned a few minutes ago, they're doctors, they're educators, they're merchants, they've got all kinds of backgrounds, but they have gravitated towards archaeology for a variety of reasons of their own. Hewett was trained as an educator. He went to college in Tarkio, Missouri. He ended up after that at the Colorado Normal School in Greeley. And this is his graduation picture taken in 1893. And my guess is that if you had told him in 1893 where he was going, and that we would be talking about him here in this room so long later about this, he would have been shocked, because that was not at all what he was setting out to do. And so to think this through a little bit, we're going to pick one area of his subsequent reputation, and I've chosen it because in the scholarly world, as the quotation that Bruce read earlier would suggest, we don't say a lot about Hewett. There's not a lot about him in the sort of professional history of American archaeology. But if there is, one of the things that is pointed out with some gratitude is his role in the passage of historic preservation legislation, particularly the Lacey Act, or also known as the Antiquities Act of 1906, which put the preservation of American archaeological remains on public land on a firm policy footing. But he wouldn't have thought of even that in 1893. So where we're going to go that same year here next to pick this thread up is to Chicago. I don't know that Hewett went to the World's Columbian Exposition, although that just about everybody who could afford it in the U.S. in those days did. A huge cultural landmark on many levels, and also in particular for American anthropology. On many levels, it's considered one of the moments in our professional history that what it is that we do, and what we did across the 20th century and beyond, started to really take shape in a very formal kind of way. There were exhibits, events of all kinds, congresses, because of it was to celebrate the Columbus anniversary, even though it happened a year late for planning reasons, right? That's a little awkward, but because of what we used to call the Columbian encounter, the encounter between Euro-Americans and Native Americans, connected with that anniversary, that became a major theme of the White City, the World's Columbian Exposition, and anthropologists and archaeologists jumped on board that. There are lots of angles to take on this, and there's actually some good writing on this. Kit Hensley and Dave Wilcox recently published an edited volume on American anthropology at the World's Columbian Exposition that's just recently come out in paperback. So if anyone's interested in that stuff, it's floating around out there, and I can afterwards I can direct you to it if you're interested. But what I'm going to pick out that is relevant to our theme today is this structure, which we see here as part of I trimmed out a part of a stereoscopic slide that was sold for people to take home and watch through their sort of weird stereoscopic viewer things, depicting a rather complicated papier-mâché structure next to the Anthropological building that was called the Cliff Dwellers. And the Cliff Dwellers was a commercial enterprise that was sponsored by some people who had originally gotten going at the Minneapolis Industrial Exposition a few years earlier. They had gone to the impresario was a man named H.J. Smith. They had gone to Colorado, they had traveled around, they had picked up artifacts, they had conducted excavations. There's all sorts of stories to pursue about them. But they came to Chicago and built this replica structure as a paying concern, and people could pay their nickel or their dime or what have you, and could go through sort of an internal space with lights and exhibits and little dioramas of Colorado cliff dwellings, as they were basically in the sort of Mesa Verde region mostly. And it was a huge hit, a huge success. And there were some women who were around this cliff dwelling, involved with it at various levels, that I think made a profound impact on where this all was going next. The first one is Alice Palmer Henderson. That's a later photograph of her taken in 1915. I don't actually have an earlier photo of her. I found this just by accident in a newspaper. But she had been with the H.J. Smith expedition in southwestern Colorado and adjacent parts of Utah as a journalist, and had been basically their publicist. And for a period of time, the newspapers of the United States were full of accounts of what was going on in Colorado with these so-called mysterious cliff dwellers, under the byline Palmer Henderson. And one of the things that will no doubt not surprise the women in the room, but thereafter she was often thought to be a man, because and that's one reason I'm sure why she selected that nom de plume. And you can actually still read substantive histories today where the name Palmer Henderson comes up and it's assumed that she was male. One thing that Alice Palmer Henderson did there was she made a presentation in the World Folklore Congress on the work that had been done in southwestern Colorado. She was one of several women on the platform that day, and created quite an impression. I've got a quotation here from the Chicago Tribune. By the way, that's why I have this thing in my hand. I'm not going to be looking at it except when I wrote something down that I absolutely wanted to quote. So the title of the article was "Cliff Dwellers and Their Rights, Folklore Society congresses on the qualities of people dead and gone. And under, a little bit later, they describe Palmer Henderson's things. Mrs. Henderson has studied everything that has been written on the subject, and last fall made a trip of several weeks to the territory occupied by those prehistoric people, end quote. Well, also on the program for the World Folklore Congress was a woman whose married name was Virginia McClurg, Virginia Donahue McClurg. She was she was a resident of Colorado Springs. She had come out there as a young woman in her early 20s, in the early 1890s, because of a family friend, and came to Colorado Springs to spend a summer and liked it and kept coming. And they came down to Santa Fe in 1893 to see the Tertio Millennial Exposition, and she became a writer. And in some ways, like Palmer Henderson, started writing articles for newspapers that would get sort of published around and shopped around. She had been to Mesa Verde in an episode that is talked about to a certain extent, but is very poorly documented in the early 1894, 1895. It was one of her autobiography talks about this a lot, but there's some issues about when that happened and things. So I'm not quite clear about any of that, but she started writing articles about it. And in 1889, the Rocky Mountain News noticed that she was working for another newspaper, which is called The Great Divide. And she said, Miss Mary Donahue will publish a series of papers describing a trip to the Aztec ruins, Aztec unquote ruins. And that doesn't mean Aztec in Aztec, New Mexico. That Aztec there was sort of a loose reference to indigenous peoples of the past of the American Southwest. And that's something that can be unpacked. And cliff dwellings of southwestern Colorado, end quote. But she wasn't in Chicago to talk about that. She gave a presentation on the Pueblo of Taos. She had a sort of an ethnohistoric talk and gave this presentation there. But I'm pretty convinced that she was in the room listening to Palmer Henderson talk, looking around the room, seeing how people were responding. She went to a reception at the cliff dwelling and sort of got a sense for the bubbling enthusiasm that was on display there, and pondered what was in it for her, just like Palmer Henderson was thinking about what was in it for her. Palmer Henderson had ambitions to become an anthropologist, and there was no path for her to be a professional in those days. And so she ended up going in a somewhat different direction, and we don't hear any more about her in this context really after about 1894. McClurg had a different idea and was more prescient, I think, in that. So by this time, by the early 1890s, there was already a long history within the Southwest itself, and to a certain extent on the national level, of concern about protecting places like the ancestral Pueblo places on the Pajarito Plateau, like places like Mesa Verde. Some of them were already long gone, had been already by that time been destroyed or looted or damaged, and there was this long history of local concern about the fate of these places, particularly because there was a lot of recognition, even quite early, in the 1860s, recognition that these were, whatever they were, whatever they represented about whatever kind of past they were, and that's an interesting angle to pursue. They had some local value. They were a local historic resource that nobody else had. And so they shouldn't be squandered. On the other hand, they were a very tempting resource to squander by local people. And so this is a picture taken from the archive in the Center for Southwest Research at UNM that was put together by a Santa Fe minister. His name was Horatio Ladd. This is Horatio Ladd and some friends up there digging holes in pueblos up there on the Pajarito Plateau. So there's this interesting thing about they should be protected, but maybe not from us, in a kind of interesting way. but that local, regional interest had been galvanizing, and McClurg saw this happening and went back to Colorado and immediately started to see what could be done about that. Well, she wasn't the only one, and I should note here parenthetically that traditionally in the United States, going back to the early part of the 19th century, historic preservation movements were led by women. And there's a long, interesting story there involved. They didn't tend to involve archaeology. They were mostly, preserving Mount Vernon in places like that. But women were really at the forefront of the whole enterprise of saving those kinds of places. And women in the West started building the argument that archaeological sites like Mesa Verde were the equivalent, not in a moral sense. All right? They're not. I mean, they are burdened by the prejudices of their era like anybody else. But they started perceiving these places as potential resources, cultural resources, like other places that were being preserved, particularly in the East. This is a tidbit from an archive at the Denver Public Library. In the minutes of a women's organization called the Monday Literary Club that was patronized by many of the sort of upper class white women in Denver. It says Mrs. Bancroft here, that would be Mary Caroline Bancroft, who was a leading social figure in Denver at the time. This is in the minutes. And there had been a presentation by one of the other members about cliff dwellers that day. And at the end of the episode, and you can see that's the minute book over there on the right-hand side as it came out of the archives in Denver, Mrs. Bancroft read a petition to Congress asking that the section of country in which were found the remains of the cliff dwellers be set aside and preserved as a park, and invited the ladies present to sign the paper, end quote. And for a woman like this and her peers to get involved with this kind of thing was particularly critical because they had access to political influence, because that was clearly what it was going to take. And any kind of movement to do this sort of stuff would require a very aggressive and targeted lobbying campaign. And I should say that this was something that Hewett also learned later on, and I think he probably learned it from this movement. And we'll get to him eventually. He's not gone forever. He'll be back. McClurg's strong point was she was perceived as a very strong lecturer, and she also had some means of her own. So she went out on tour literally right after she got back from Colorado, from the exposition, and was all over, particularly the eastern United States, promoting the concept of preservation. So, and here, this is the lecture she gave at the Yonkers Lawn Tennis Club in Yonkers, New York. And that was one of dozens of places where she would come to town, make arrangements. She would give this thing, and women in particular would show up. And that network became pretty substantial and nationwide fairly quickly. And so the work that women were doing, particularly in Denver, connected to these things. And at federations of women's clubs all over the country, this issue would come up. There's a quotation I have for you here from the Kansas City Journal from 1898, where it says as follows: club women whose attention has been drawn to Colorado of late will be interested in the latest practical work, and the emphasis there on practical work is important for her audience, of the Colorado Federation of Women's Clubs in the preservation of the Colorado cliff dwellings. These wonderful mementos are in danger of destruction with the advance of civilization, end quote. So there's a lot happening in this regard. McClurg played a major role in this, but shall we say that she wasn't, I think at this point, it's pretty clear, she wasn't much of a team player in this regard. And she saw all these things moving and developing in certain kinds of ways, but she was dissatisfied with some of the directions this was taking, some of the ideas that were floating around, and she had her own ideas about that. So what did she do? She founded her own women's organization, the Colorado Cliff Dwellings Association. And as you can see here from some of their letterhead, they made the today unfortunate decision of using a swastika as part of their symbol. So that's problematic in our terms. And I am told, I don't read Latin, but I'm told that Dux Femina Facti, which was their motto, can be translated as, and the women shall lead, for the organization. And the women on her board, some of them there are quite prominent in their own way, all Coloradans. And she was the regent general of the Colorado Cliff Dwelling Association, which became a profound political and social influence on what became lobbying and efforts to preserve Southwestern antiquities. And here's another look at them. This is from the San Francisco Call in November 1901. The title of that is, and it's not the best photograph, apologies, Enthusiastic Women Hew a Pathway to the Lofty Ruins of the Mesa Verde Cliff Dwellers. That's McClurg on the top left, and then some of the other ladies of the organization down below her. This is San Francisco, right? And it would be a mistake to underestimate, I think, the power of this movement, although, again, it probably wouldn't surprise some people that that role has been underemphasized in a lot of the literature until quite recently, discussing the development of historic preservation in the United States. All right, so there are some interesting, and I'm calling them complications here, interesting side lights and tangents that went on at this time. And it tells us more about McClurg, to follow some of them. I'm going to follow one of them, at least, here, to trace it. And this is concerned with the indigenous places that we now know as Gran Quivira in central New Mexico. That's a picture taken by the peripatetic Southwestern booster and general sociopath Charles Lummis, and sold for sale in 1890. Gran Quivira and the associated Quarai and Abo, the Salinas Pueblos, had been, like other ruins and historical places in the Southwest, had been the subject of a lot of attention over the years. Interestingly, though, Gran Quivira was different because it had a resident, and that resident was a woman named Clara Corbin. Clara Corbin was actually legally blind at this point, but she and her husband had homesteaded Gran Quivira. And I won't get into the weeds about the Homestead Act, but basically they had applied to own it. They applied to the federal government to own 160 acres of the central part of the Pueblo. They were required to do some things to prove up their claim, as they say, but they that was their plan, was to own the Pueblos here. And here's and the husband dies. He was like a Civil War veteran and had been wounded, dies, and she stays on somehow at Gran Quivira. So sightless preemptor of prehistoric ruins here says she was held ghostly. That you can see what's going on. So a very sort of imaginative and complicated vision of what was going on at Gran Quivira. She wrote, what would you want to call it, a musical mystery? Well, she called it a musical mystery, about what happened in the past at Gran Quivira. And I will tell you, I have not read it. But there's a beautiful copy in the UCLA Special Collections, and one of these days I'm going to sit down and read it from cover to cover. Clara Corbin was contacted by Virginia McClurg, who was in Colorado Springs. And McClurg writes her and says, we hear so many good things about you, and this is a great thing, and you're doing great things for women. Why don't you come up to Colorado Springs and talk to us about it? Which she does. And McClurg sizes her up, sizes up the situation, and files a lawsuit against her. Because she knows the rules about homesteads, and she can't imagine that Clara Corbin, who's legally blind and seems to be a bit of a recluse and a little eccentric, could have done the things you're supposed to do, like plant crops and bring water and things you're supposed to do to prove up a homestead. So she sued her, and well, I'm not sure you'd say that, but there was a legal action that was followed. McClurg challenged the homestead claim. And there was, so for a period of time in 1902, it was all over the papers here in Santa Fe because it was a little quirky. This happened all the time, except not usually were there ruins involved, and not usually was there a blind lady living in the middle of the ruins and being sued by another woman to get control of these ruins, because I think McClurg was hedging her bets here. Because everybody was thinking about Mesa Verde, but there were a lot of people stirring that pot. And I think she was thinking, well, here's another ruin, and this is maybe another place we can focus our energies here. And if I get it, maybe I won't have to worry about all these other people being involved. And I say this just because most of the people leading this fight, not all, but most, saw something in the future for them to be able to take advantage of. And it's pretty clear that McClurg is going like, I don't know what we're going to do with this, but we're going to get control of it, and we're going to chase it down. She won several stages of this, and then it all goes up to Washington, and somebody higher up in the Interior Department sent it back and said, no, she can keep it. And the mystery, of course, is who was up there and who did she know and who got called, and so maybe we'll figure that out before too long. But I should also say that McClurg had by this time cultivated patrons in the Brooklyn Museum. And so she could use Brooklyn Museum letterhead and flash it around. And there's a lot of communication back and forth between her and Brooklyn. And it is actually kept, by the way, it was drawn to my attention by the superintendent at Grand Quivira. So the Park Service has a handle on some of this, and a very interesting thing. Well, all right. Ultimately, after great stress and strain, and with the critical lobbying talents of Edgar Lee Hewett on a formal side, and the backing of the national women's organizations on many levels, the Antiquities Act is put before Congress, and one of the major players here would be the Smithsonian Institution. And after considerable discussion, it passed in 1906. And that's a typical headline of the era. American Antiquities Act to preserve them is going into effect. Government departments will divide responsibility. Ruins may be examined for public museums, etc. Okay, one of the important things to know about this, and that people often lose track of when they're thinking about the Antiquities Act, was it pertains only to federal land. So it has nothing to say about state land. It has nothing to say about private land. And if McClurg had gotten a hold of that Grand Quivira, then that would have been hers, even under this legislation. It brought, for the first time, in a significant way, federal oversight, or it brought antiquities into federal policy. And that rolls on from here. And I should say that if anybody knows the National Park Service historian Richard West Sellers, who used to live in Santa Fe, is no longer with us, but he's written a lot of pretty interesting things about the Antiquities Act and how it came about. Well, and Hewett was involved, and he was able to ride in the professional world, the growing professional world of American archaeology. He could ride the wave for a little bit, and that started him climbing the ladder of American anthropology. And I should say that this was because after a 3-year stint as the president of the New Mexico Normal School, and this is one that's connection with my great-grandmother, he was seen as a sort of a liberal influence, and what that meant then wasn't the same as, it's kind of laughable today. He was fired by his board of regents, and he was in his mid-40s by that time. And what does a mid-40s guy who thought he was going to be a university president and do whatever do thereafter? Well, he had been visiting archaeological places as a hobby on his summer vacations, and as was noted a little earlier, he took some students there on field trips and things, and he pivoted to that to see if that had more action for him, and he knew a little bit about it. He at least knew the ground, but because he was he had been a good university president, he knew how to schmooze people and talk to things, and that's how come he got involved with the Smithsonian, and that gets to this point. So it's a whole new gig for him, and he's able to use it to get places. Well, also in 1906, Mesa Verde becomes a national park. And as some of you probably know, a national park requires congressional legislation, whereas the Antiquities Act allowed for the president to create national monuments. It's kind of a different thing there. But so the goals of the women advocates and the goals of particular sort of active individuals like Hewett were accomplished in 1906. McClurg, maybe not so much, because again, she was in a bit of it was a complicated situation with many other people planning it. So she had proposals. A particular person she wanted to be the new superintendent didn't get elected, and all of a sudden people were realizing that they actually couldn't get their way much when the federal government was in charge, and there were other situations that had to be dealt with. And let me treat them as complexities here, complications again. On the right, this is one of my all-time favorite images, and this is something that Heather is in charge of down at the Ryan Helico Chavez Library. It's a newsletter that was published, prepared, not published, by some of Hewett's students and the attendees of some of his archaeological schools in the Frioles Canyon in the early 1910s. They were fortunate. We are particularly fortunate that one of his people that worked for him was a very talented young artist. His name was Don Beauregard. And so there are amazing caricatures in the first year of the Frioles Gazette. So that would be Hewett on the left. That would be his associate Lummis down there on the ground. They're headed out to do some field work somewhere on the Pajarito Plateau. Except that that's federal land. And after the passage of the Antiquities Act, they had to ask. They had to apply for permission to work on federal land, and that proved difficult. I think of this, and I call this the Academy Strikes Back, because it was the people who thought that by passage of this law as professionals, that would kind of clear the way for them, and it turns out that the government regulations had requirements, like you had to write reports, and you had to make maps, and you had to do certain things, and Hewett and his associates thought this was outrageous. He writes a letter to Lummis in 1907 after a strenuous bout with some federal authorities. He said, all the red tape was gone through and every condition of those cussed rules I adhered to. There was a little Smithsonian meddling that I didn't quite like, and on the whole, it riles me, end quote. Lummis and Hewett actually, by, I think, very creative lobbying, managed to prevent the government from, they could hijack the regulatory process so that efforts to make kind of a cohesive set of federal regulations about antiquities never happened. And so each federal bureaucracy made its own in the end, and they could kind of play them off against each other. And that problem actually still exists today. So a complication may be unforeseen, and a complication that you will not see in the historical literature about the Antiquities Act, which is often seen as a great triumph, and it certainly is, but there's some interesting twists and turns to where it went. Well, there were other complications, and one of those, and many of you know about this, was in 1908. A company got together and bought a so-called cliff dwelling in southwestern Colorado, dismantled it, moved it to Manitou Springs, adjacent to Colorado Springs, and rebuilt it there as a tourist attraction because it was hard to get people all the way out to Cortez, and people in Colorado Springs didn't get any business, so maybe this would help there. And Virginia McClurg was deep in this in a way because she sort of saw it as another opportunity that may happen. Hewett was also in it, but tried very hard not to look like he was in it. And so he would make various kinds of noises about sort of making it work for everybody. So what do we say here? One of the women in Colorado, a woman named Lucy Peabody, he was very sort of talked to him a lot. Pointed out what a disaster this was for the preservation movement and for a lot of things. She says, "I regret exceedingly that this miserable business could not have been stopped. Since it was impossible, as you say," meaning as Hewett has told her, "the less notice we take of it, the better." And that's sort of been, well, for a long, not so much lately, for a long time, that was sort of the Southwestern anthropologist's perspective on this thing, which is still there in Colorado Springs. So things were happening, and this is now the time, and I appreciate Heather's going through a bit of the institution creation, because I'm not going to talk about that because that would keep you here for a lot longer. But this is 1907, 1908. This is when things are happening in Santa Fe, establishing the museum. It comes up pretty quick, establishing the School of American Archaeology. But I want to look at one place that where Virginia McClurg and Edgar Lee Hewett came together a few years later, which is at Mesa Verde. So when McClurg realizes that, that there's no real, that there is no place for her here. There's also no place for women here in this whole scenario. It's evolving in the National Park Service's domains in southwestern Colorado. She realizes that the only way that they can make something happen is via money. Because as no surprise here, the federal government and their national park system that was just evolving early on here was always short of appropriations that her organization and some others could accept donations. And so she got together with Hewett to try and fund some work at Mesa Verde in honor of the women who had done all this lobbying. And that work took place at one of the places at Mesa Verde, which is now called Balcony House. So here's a letter from McClurg to Hewett. We could sit here and look it up right now. In one of the scans one of the elements of the papers that have been scanned are now available to the public, writing to him in very friendly terms. "I am about to suggest this, that your association," meaning Hewett here in Santa Fe at the School of American Archaeology, "should apply for and secure the permission to excavate at Balcony House to save the looting of the ruin by the Smithsonian." This summer, meaning before you get the permit, you and I would meet there at Balcony House and make our plans, perhaps take out a few stones to show that we mean business, end quote. So they become, for a period of time, they become partners. So in some of Hewett's letters here, and this is in September of 1910, there's a letter from McClurg to the treasurer of the whole Archaeological Institute of America, of whom he was sort of a subset. "I have the honor to transmit to you from the Colorado Cliff Dwellings Association $838 the Colorado Cliff Dwellings Association has appropriated to the restoration of Balcony House, Mesa Verde Park, Colorado, to be undertaken by Director Edgar Lee Hewett of your association," end quote. And the correspondence about Balcony House is fascinating, and I'm not going to oppress you with this here because we're getting close to wrap-up time. As the McClurg and Hewett are discussing how this is going to play out, meanwhile, Hewett is talking to Jesse Walter Fuchs, who is the Smithsonian archaeologist, saying, just be patient with us. We're okay. We're not going to. This is all on the up. And Fuchs is saying, are you guys sure you can really do this in this funny kind of way? I mean, it's a fascinating view of the kinds of negotiations that took place in this era at these places around the subject of historic preservation, because Fuchs couldn't afford it. He knew he couldn't afford it, but he also didn't want to let anybody else on the property because did I say they were all self-interested? He was he didn't want them to mess around with what he was doing. And he's not famously a great archaeologist himself, right? So all these things played out over a couple of years, resulting in, this is one of Jesse Nussbaum's photograph, and that's a view of some of their restoration, if you want to call it that, view reconstruction, if you like, at Balcony House. And for a period of time, there was actually a plaque at Balcony House describing this work and noting the role of the women of Colorado in raising the money to preserve it. I don't think that plaque is still there, which is by itself an interesting story. But at this point, this little episode happens in Colorado, and Hewett and McClurg sort of go their separate ways. So let's pull a couple of conclusions out of this. One, archaeologists like to talk about sort of ideas about the past and what you've learned about the past and what more we know about what went on, what we've learned through our methods and complicated things. But one thing that gets skipped typically is the critical central importance of these various players of that era. Not in their discoveries, they're all terrible archaeologists, not in what they learned, but in this, which to them was sort of a sidelight, was in the preservation of these places and the attraction of the attention of the American public to their importance. And that's central. Well, the preservation story is kind of open-ended and has a lot of other angles to it. So this is also from the Friulis Gazette files in the Angelico Chavez Library. It's an imagined view of what Bandelier would look like today, or at least today in 1920-something, if it had been turned into a commercial business. Postcards, there's a swimming pool there, dance hall, cafe. Prescient in some kinds of ways, although and I'm not at all critical of my colleagues in the Department of the Interior, but it's interesting that see what their visioning would happen, and basically what happened in Manitou Springs is not terribly far from this. So worth thinking about. So this is the work of Agnes Laut. All right. So what about Virginia McClurg? Well, she went off in different directions because there was no room. There was no room there. And there was no room for anyone like her at all there. And she did a variety of related things, wrote things before the end of her life. But the organization that she established had some interesting twists and turns. So this is in the archives of the Autry Museum in Los Angeles. It's a program of the California chapter of the Colorado Cliff Dwellings Association, which survived into the 1930s. And this is their 1909 activity program. And inside, there's lists of lectures that they were sponsoring. They're going to come there. They have a song. So they actually had a group song. And ultimately turned it all they had by the end of this over to what was then the Southwest Museum. And in the middle 90s, I was talking to the librarian there, Kim Walters, who's a remarkable individual, since retired and moved to Tucson. And she goes, "Check out this box," and pulled it out. And it's a remarkable story. And some of these women could be traced back to Colorado. And you look at the LA Times at this point, and they're lobbying on their own. They're not in Colorado, but they're also promoting some local things. So there's a fascinating legacy there that needs further unpacking. And then we have Edgar Lee Hewett, seen in a later stage of life, not looking so happy. Maybe, we can't intuit what exactly was bothering him here. But that's at Mesa Verde. Taken another one apparently by Jesse Nussbaum at Mesa Verde, although I wonder. A famous slogan of Hewett's that is recorded from when the Antiquities Act was passed, he was riding a horse, apparently, to Mexico City from here. And he was in the Yaqui country of northern Mexico when he got a telegram saying it passed. And the line that he gave, and this appears a lot, was "Estoy muy contento." I'm very content that this has all happened. But when you look at something like an image like this and think about some later things, we talk about Hewett in subsequent lectures and things, I don't think that contentment lasted very long. So it's worth it for us to ponder, to kind of get into the weeds there, to look deep into these archival resources that are available to us now, and talk about not the capital S stories, not the sort of meta language of the big things, but look at the smaller things, look at the relationship between people, and really find value in the complicated relationships that we can now study at our convenience. So thanks very much. We will have a few minutes for questions, and there are mics here, and so just raise your hand, and we'll call on you and go from there.
Anyone? You covered it all?
Every
I
scrap.
have so many questions
Every
for you.
scrap. Well, you can ask one.
No,
You want to? Take a mic. It's all right. Just take a mic, and that way it's clear.
Oh, thank you. I have a loud voice anyway. So,
Yeah.
at the very beginning, it showed a date or dates. It was like 1860 something to 1849.
Well, no, there should be 19, right? So,
Thank you. I was wondering if I missed
thanks.
something.
No, yeah,
Okay.
you did and I did. So thanks for pointing out 1946, right? Something like that. Yeah. Thanks. Just, well, let's get a mic to you. They took them from, well, there's some complicated stories there, from allegedly private land in southwestern Colorado or adjacent Utah. And they rebuilt them in their own way. So it wasn't as if they, so it did not, the thing that's interesting to think about is sort of that's what they did at Chicago with that cliff dwelling, but they just, that was imaginary. And they didn't use original parts because, of course, they might probably thought about it. In fact, I think they did. But it was expensive to ship all those stones to Chicago, so this was not a new idea.
The Manitou Springs, they dismantled a standing pueblo, and part of it had fallen down, and they numbered every single piece, loaded on a rail car, and brought it to Colorado Springs, and disregarded any number on any piece.
Other questions?
Anyone else?
Yeah. Don't go see it.
You must have a question. You have a question? No?
Her comment was, "This is still there," and I said, "Unfortunately, yes, it is still there." But I don't remember seeing it when I was a kid. I might have. I don't think so, but I'm not going now. So there's a question.
You were talking briefly, he is a Okay, could you expound a little more about Charles Lummis? Because he had a vested interest in Los Angeles, and did he later get involved with this group of women?
Yes, well, yeah, yes. Yes, and that thereby hangs a story. And I'll say this by way of introduction, that Hewett plays a large role in my book, Ruins and Rivals, Lummis. And so I spent a lot of time looking into his history. And because I'm now based in Los Angeles, I have spent some more time there. Lummis was a very complicated person, and did a lot to promote the kind of romantic image of the American Southwest that sort of took hold in the late 19th, early 20th centuries. These days, it's hard to get around the sort of dark side of Charles Lummis. And I actually published an article in El Palacio a couple years ago, which some people may have seen. If you haven't, it's not tooting my own horn here, but it's worth looking at. It is the best documented case of sexual harassment in an archaeological context that I have ever seen, courtesy of Charles Lummis keeping everything. And so, a smart guy, eccentric guy, deeply misogynistic, and his legacy is problematic. So there's a book that I could write there about Lummis, or probably about the extraordinary women that Lummis treated badly. But I'd have to spend a couple years with him, you know, and I don't think I've got the stomach for it. So yeah, but he and Hewett were deep in cahoots with each other. Hewett was, as far as we can tell, did not share some of Lummis's attitudes. He was apparently much more of a Victorian rectitude kind of 19th century guy. Lummis was not.
Yes, please.
So I just had a thought at some point in the presentation when Hewett was going toward the Smithsonian. Yeah. Was McClure and the Colorado women behind or manipulating that?
So in effect, Hewett's almost political base was fairly weak. And New Mexico was not particularly influential, still territory at that time. McClurg had access to a much more engaged political community in Colorado. And there's a lot of commentary in the correspondence about talking to the senators from Colorado and the representatives. So they basically lobbied Congress. And Hewett's angle was more, and he worked with the Smithsonian on this, to work kind of the bureaucratic side of it. He was very much of a bureaucratic kind of guy, and he sort of understood that. So when it gets around to the regulations, he basically arranged a bunch of meetings with obscure representatives of the Forestry Service, and that's how he can mess it up. He doesn't necessarily have the ear of Congress. So you could imagine they're lobbying on parallel tracks, right? The Smithsonian was influential. The people on board and Hewett and things were showing up to prestigious panels, and they went to congressional committees and things. Meanwhile, the senators were getting letters from constituents, suggesting that they vote for these things to keep their people happy back in Denver. So I think that's kind of how it works.
Last question. Well, we thank you very much, James.
Thanks for
we look forward to seeing you on February 24th when Hannah and Alicia, thank you, will be presenting. And then in March, Joseph Woody Aguilar will be presenting about Hewett's legacy to his community, San Ildefonso. And then I'm the runner-up at the very end and making sense of all this for all of us. So thank you again for your attendance, and see you soon.